Why is it premature to split rational demand avoidance from pathological demand avoidance by Richard Woods, a London South Bank University PhD student? So this is a test recording to check my timings for a talk that I'm delivering on the 4th of November 2024 for a participatory autism research collective workshop that's being held virtually but run by Edge Hill University. So yeah, I do have a few conflicts of interest. I'm gonna just skim over this. If you want to read them, you can pause the video, and they'll also be in the slides for the actual talk. So yeah, a bit about my perspective. I was diagnosed as autistic in 2012. I now try to use a post-autistic identity. I do meet Elizabeth Neese's PDA behaviour profile, but I'm not emotionally attached to it. I'm trying to avoid using I'm trying to avoid basing my identity on the kind of psychiatric categories as much as possible. I favour a transdiagnostic approach to mapping and supporting features that are associated with psychiatric categories. I'm part of the critical autism / disability studies group at London South Bank University, and I'm currently on a gap year for my PhD. I am the project lead for the PDA special issue in Frontiers in Education. I do peer review PDA manuscripts, and I try to equally respect divergent views on PDA to synthesise an appropriate interpretation of it. This is my interpretation of PDA literature, others may disagree. So, there's quite a bit to cover in this, and I'm so so yeah. We're briefly talking about PDA's current context and avoidance to a single name. Like kind of the history of kind of the demand avoidance sorry, very briefly about demand avoidance, a history of the kind of rational demand avoidance and the PDA binary, issues with the kind of what is rational and irrational, how demand avoidance exists in a continuum, and kind of measuring should be inherently problematic. So yeah, and also what is viewed as rational versus irrational is dependent on value judgments. So there should be a diversity of what is rational versus rational demand avoidance, and then how this rational irrational demand avoidance maps onto impairment definitions, and then how this binary is due to kind of how it's constructed, basically why it's constructed. So then there's concluding comments. So yeah, they commentary on the side. So sides with green at the top will have commentary notes in the PowerPoint, but I'll put the commentary notes into a separate Word and PDF document for people to access. Um, so there, no, there's not activities in there. I'll have to kind of delete that in the final slides. So provide information and space for no. That's again. I'll have to kind of delete that. Give a moment. So yeah, I mean there will be example memes showing the rational manner, the RDA and PDA binary before the references, and there'll be reflected questions collated again before the references. So yeah, caring about PDA. So there's a lot of assumptions about it, and has a lot of kind of an eclectic mix of kind of characteristics. So the Gadal systematic review kind of critique PDA for having unspecific dimensional features, like having like come to role play features, kind of speculate underlying causes, obviously demand avoidance, speculated motives for that demand avoidance, like PDA having like unrelated, well, at least relatively intact theory of mind or empathy, and kind of speculated emotional references. So I kind of commented elsewhere that PDA has a spiky profile of features, but kind of moving on. So Roy Grinke has noted that once a diagnosis takes hold and serves as a hub around which so much wealth, so many people and activities kind of coalesce, it takes on a life of its own as an authentic naturalised classification. This category in turn provides an incentive for manufactured people with that diagnosis of autism for whose presence and need support this financial infrastructure. I'd say that this is kind of applicable. I would say it is applicable to pedo profile of autism. Um, so it's noted that kind of interest in the concept of PDA largely centres on the UK and at present is a culture-bound concept, and then that in the UK, PDA interest in it has risen sharply over the last 10 years, and it outstrips it way outstrips the research base for it. It's also been noted that kind of people researching PDA have often done it from their understandings of autism, and also that kind of caregivers are highly motivated to take part in PDA research. So, what do we actually know about PDA? So, I'll take this quote by Gilbert et al. 2024b. We also agree with Richard Woods that it remains to be seen if PDA or EDA will fit into the future psychiatric diagnostic systems and whether it is desirable at all to retain it as a unitary condition. What we already know is that the situations that lead up to what we describe as EDA or PDA phenomena represent a severe burden to parents, and that it is likely that it also very very considerable burden for the children and for people interacting with the affected family. Um, so yeah, moving on to kind of PDA's names. So there's a lot of unease over the pathological descriptor. Some have said that is derogatory and unhelpful. It's quite interesting when you kind of get into Newton's scholarship on it. So she said that her original name for PDA was Mardy syndrome, um, but she originally chose pathological demand avoidance as a kind of descriptive name for it. But she said it was hopefully temporary and was open to alternative names for the actual kind of category that she's putting forward as PDA. Due to the unease with the pathological descriptor, there are over 10 different names in print on the topic. You can see a list of extant names for PDA over a couple of slides before the references. So, yeah, in terms of what a demand is, it's any stimuli which should kind of force people or try to kind of force people to engage with it. So you can have internal ones, such as like a demand to kind of watch oneself having a flu jab, to external ones, which can be rules, boundaries, and requests from other people. And the avoidance is resistance to demand. So demand avoidance is a transactional and kind of general phenomenon to human experience. It's important to note that um, how aversively one experiences demands is often transient and can change over time. So yeah, um, so Autistics critical of PDA have put forward rational demand avoidance to highlight that one can often have good reasons to express demand avoidance. Um, However, in 2020, there was some research put forward suggesting that rational demand avoidance be used to describe a group of children and young persons that started expressing significant demand avoidance, usually due to specific environmental triggers. Since then, it's kind of been adopted that there is a separation of what is rational from what is rational demand avoidance from pathological demand avoidance um, due to viewing PDA as having illogical demand avoidance, and this has kind of been taken as rote and as kind of gospel by many within the kind of autistic PDA community. So, for example, see kind of the memes by Sally Cat at the end before the references. So currently there is a dichotomy of rational demand avoidance representing non-PDA demand avoidance versus irrational demand avoidance indicative of PDA being proposed by some people. I would point out that me and David Milton, who mainly proposed rational demand avoidance, never intended the term to be used to exclude people or to be used to create a binary of RDA versus PDA. So, yeah, if one actually considers what is irrational or rational, there's actually a few options available. So you would have neither rational or irrational nature versus rational nature versus irrational nature, and a fourth one of both rational and irrational in nature. And I'll kind of touch upon more about the nature of what is rational versus irrational in a moment. But there's also, so if you want to see the table for the logic of this, that is again found before the references. But there's also a fifth option, which is just running away and not seeing it. Um, so yeah, one can avoid deciding if something is rational or irrational, and there's actually kind of there are reasons why someone can do this. One itself, it is demands, which people might find aversive and avoid answering. Um, but it's also might be better uses of people time and spoons to not um, to avoid deciding if it's rational or irrational. There's also one might instead want to focus on just that people are expressing significant demand avoidance and adequately helping them and those around them. But also, it has been argued that prematurely deciding that something is kind of pathological or irrational avoidance to demands could lead to people being discriminated against in workplace or educational based settings. But also, if you engage in kind of progressive autism research literature, it would argue that people should be taking into account the full context of people's actions, especially in social situations. And there's a growing body of literature indicating that what can be attributed to be within the individual of autistic people is actually a result of transactional processes. So one can view the rational versus rational demand avoidance kind of binary as being inherently problematic. There's also many reasons why people who are expressing significant demand avoidance will either um, not will either be unaware of if their demand avoidance is rational or irrational, or just not care if their demand avoidance is rational or irrational. So, I mean, I pointed out in 2022 that alexithymia, interoception, and theory of mind issues can prevent many people from being aware of if their demand avoidance is irrational or rational. I'd also point out that inherently, if people are highly aroused while expressing significant amounts of demand avoidance, they will be processing information more slowly and often more emotively, and therefore they will be unaware of if the demand avoidance is rational or irrational and just even not care about it. It's also from a monotropic cognitive state perspective, many autistic people will be unaware of if their demand avoidance is rational or irrational due to only processing few amounts of information at any one time. Um, it's also worth pointing out that if one considers the nature of what demand avoidance, it will present as a continuum or a continua within the human population. So this is a quote from the DSM-5 TR, and it basically just says that the current body of scientific evidence favours a dimensional view to concepts of diagnosis and mental disorders, and an imitation of the categorical approach. It says fail to find zones of rarity between diagnoses, i.e., delineation of kind of psychiatric categories from one another by natural boundaries. The need for kind of intermediate categories like schizoaffective disorder, high rates of co-occurring issues, need for frequent use of other and specific diagnoses, relative lack of utility in furthering identification or unique antecedent validators for most psychiatric categories, and lack of kind of specific treatment for various psychiatric categories. So, yeah, it's also worth pointing out that if one looks at the cross-cutting symptom measure tools that are in the DSM-5 and the DSM-5 TR, there are some relatively interesting items in relation towards demand avoidance. So from the adult self-report version, so avoiding situations that makes one anxious, and from the observer-rated caregiver version, there's said she could not do things she wanted to do or should have done because they made her feel nervous. Yeah, it's also been pointed out that PDA has no specificity, and that I would also point out that most, if not all, humans will benefit from being in charge or having a sense of control. So kind of saying that PDA has a higher need for control or a higher need for autonomy is inherently problematic, and I'll kind of touch upon this later. So, yeah, I mean, the DSM-5 is quite clear that it is often problematic working out what is kind of normal behaviour and what is pathological behaviour. And likewise, it has been pointed out in literature that it can be problematic reliably measuring many aspects of PDA features. So this is an interesting quote from Weirtel, which is applicable to PDA because the article in question mentions PDA. So they said that they observed how extremely difficult, even impossible, it is to define boundaries of the different subgroups, and that's a DSM-4 autism subgroups. Um, so among children, adults with autism spectrum disorder, like kind of categories, that the other subgroups, that other subgroups have been suggested, and the same problem of defining the boundaries exists for all of those proposed subgroups, and that's applicable to PDA. There's also difficulty in defining the boundaries between autism and an enormous range of kind of typical development, especially individuals who have very high skills in specific areas. It's worth pointing out that Elizabeth Newson and Phil Christie have written about how often the greatest skill of PDAs is their demand avoidance. The basically. Um, so yeah, I would kind of point out that what is viewed as rational or irrational is based on value judgments. So Gilbert et al. 2024b pointed out that often demand avoidance in PDA is viewed as irrational by external observers' bias, and that will be often value judgments based on white, middle class, straight male value judgments or values. So what is rational or irrational is inherently subjective, and that different cultures have different values. So what is rational or ordinary and irrational or unordinary varies from culture to culture. So, for example, autistics tend to use the full pause, while non-autistics tend to clap someone at the end of the talks. Um, so yeah, if you want to take a very literal and pertinent example, prominent PDA critics of PDA often receive ad hominem attacks. So, for example, Damien Milton has had a Milton-splaining, and Damien Milton was had received a defamatory inaccurate petition, which had over 700 responses in 2 days in 2018. There is a meme showing an attack against Damien Milton, which is shown before the references. I've been consistently attacked for over 7 years, and I've been told I can expect to be attacked while I'm critical of PDA. So I'm kind of expecting to receive quite a lot of flack for this talk. Um, it's also claimed that I'm not a PDA, despite people making this claim not knowing me as the person or seeing my medical records. Um, so it appears that such kind of actions against kind of people who are significantly critical of PDA, such actions against people like myself and Damien are viewed as justified and acceptable by the PDA community. This is just a quick thought experiment to kind of highlight just how subjective viewing demand avoidance as a rational is. So, how would a living human, how would a human living 20,000 years ago react if one demanded them to brush to brush their teeth, assuming toothpaste and a toothbrush are magically available to this human living 20,000 years ago? And how would you classify their response as rational or irrational? For example, so I would point out that a human living 20,000 years ago would likely avoid that demand because they would not have a concept to brush their teeth. And it seems pretty neutral in my view to that demand audience would be neutral because it just wouldn't have a concept of brushing their teeth. This thought experiment can be adapted for many modern demands, so like going to school, for example, or wearing shoes. So those two kind of questions of the thought experiment kind of highlight how the modern world is just filled with constant and unending demands. So yeah, the global majority, or others of markedly different values to the global north, will have different rational or ordinary and therefore rational and unordinary demands. The logical consequence of that is that there will be many different rational or ordinary and irrational and unordinary demand avoidance in different cultures. So if one accepts the RDA PDA binary, rational demand avoidance and pathological demand avoidance will present divergently in cultures with significantly different values. So, for example, how rational demand avoidance and pathological demand avoidance presents in individuals' cultures should be significantly different from collectivist cultures, and I would just say um, is different. So, also, if one engages with the diagnostic thresholds of PDA within the PDA literature, they would see that they have different diagnostic thresholds. So, this is a brief diagram showing diagnostic thresholds versus kind of predicted prevalence. So, this is kind of in frequency and intensity of demand avoidance on the y-axis and numbers of people on the x-axis. I have a 9,000 word blog post explaining this diagram if people want to go away and read it. But what it basically suggests is that the Eaton and Weaver threshold is higher than the Wing et al., which is higher than Newson et al., and then higher than the extreme demand avoidance questionnaire threshold, which is important because most of the empirical research from PDA is done using the extreme demand avoidance questionnaire. So, yeah, it's pointed out that there are PDA diagnoses kicking around which are different to that advocated by PDA profile of autism advocates, which is what these two quotes highlight. I would also point out that with the huge variation in clinical practice and how autism is diagnosed across the UK, and in particular England, I need to kind of change that. That there'll be huge variation in how PDA is diagnosed. I have made a request to Autistica for the information of this research that for the PDA information from that research, like general information. I'm not asked for specifics, but so it's also worth pointing out that it's a privilege to have a PDA diagnosis, and it's also a privilege to be part of the PDA community. Not every PDA can be or wishes to be part of the PDA community, and it's also likely that many PDAs will have an avoidance to demand to be part of the PDA community. So, yeah, this is just a reflective kind of question. So, when Newson reported her first 13 to 14 cases, she said that 9 of them had PDA and that it was less clear in 4 to 5 of those cases. I'd point out that I'd ask like how many of Newton's original 13 to 14 PDA cases would likely be viewed as having rational demand avoidance or PDA under the RDA PDA binary. So that's a question for people to go away and reflect upon. So it's actually quite important how PDA is currently often modelled and described in research. So this diagram is showing inverse support functioning, which is as inverse support needs and kind of intelligence. So you have the DSM-5 autism kind of here, you have profound autism down here, and kind of pathological demand avoidance over here. Like, please don't verify this diagram, it's pretty problematic. The reason why I mention this is because often PDA is researched in PDAs who can speak or have or without intellectual disability. So what that means is that how we often describe PDA is going to be different from how PDA presents in non-speaking PDAs and PDAs with intellectual disability. I'd suggest that those two demographics will have a different repertoire of demand avoidance behaviours, and probably have different potentially different causal mechanisms. Likewise, we know that often co-occurring issues and difficulties in autistic people presents differently in non-autistic people, and that co-occurring difficulties in autistic people can have different causal mechanisms to those in non-autistic people. So what that means is that PDA is likely to present differently in non-autistic people. I should point out this is just a diagram which shows PDA having a spiky profile and it being the kind of intersection of various co-occurring difficulties, specifically kind of anxiety, ADHD, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder kind of characteristics, features from oppositional defiant disorder conduct disorder and kind of trauma. Um, so yeah, so it kind of begs the question like who gets to decide what is rational or irrational demand-avoidance in non-speaking PDAs, PDAs with intellectual disability, non-autistic PDAs, PDAs from global majority cultures such as collectivist-based cultures, and PDAs that are not part of the PDA community. Um, yeah, there's also problems with the kind of rational or rational binary in terms when one looks at various impairment definitions. So this is the kind of Equality Act definition of impairment. So what is substantial and long term mean? So substantial is more than minor or trivial, e.g. it takes much longer than it usually would to complete a daily task like getting dressed, and long term means 12 months or more, e.g. kind of a breathing condition that develops as a result of a lung infection. I'd also point out this is the definition of impairment under social model of disability. Is that is the function is the functional limitation within the kind of individual caused by physical, mental, or sensory impairment. Um, these kind of definitions matter because the impairment doesn't matter if the it doesn't matter if the impairment from demand avoidance is rational or irrational in nature. So what that means is it's possible for someone to be impaired by their demand avoidance, even to impaired them, even to pervasive amounts, and it be for entirely irrational reasons. Um, so it gets a bit more interesting when you look at the definition for psychiatric disorder within the DSM-5 or the DSM-5 TR. Again, the actual impairment values is so the mental disorder usually associated with significant distress and or disability in social, occupational or other important areas of activities, which again mirrors the previous two definitions. However, what matters here is that it has to contradict kind of culture norms, and that within kind of our Western cultures, that again will be white male, straight, middle class based values. So if one is defining PDA as a psychiatric category, the demand avoidance should be contradicting kind of white, middle class, straight, male, and middle aged values. So, and one can question if we want PDA to do that, and I'd point out that the kind of progressive autism literature would view that as being problematic because it would be contradicting the autistic rights movement and in general and the parallel neurodiversity movement kind of values. So there's also kind of general history within autism elsewhere of kind of problematic false dichotomies. So like the low functioning versus high functioning binary has been problematic for the people being labelled with either kind of low functioning or high functioning. So, for an example, within the England's autism, the 2015 England autism strategy, it says on page 19, this is particularly important for some people with autism, including those with Asperger's syndrome, who may face very significant challenges in their everyday lives, despite having average above average intelligent quotient. So, and obviously, many autistic advocates and researchers oppose functioning categories, including kind of profound autism. I view pathological demand-avoidance as a profile of autism to be a functioning category, even though I know that some people would disagree with me there. It matters in terms of how the kind of PDA strategies seem to replicate generic good practice. I'd just say that they do. Like teachers, some research has suggested teachers already use strategies and resources which might be effective with PDA. It's been pointed out by Jonathan Green and Jonathan Green multiple times that comparable approaches to the PDA strategies have been used with autistic people independent of the PDA category for years. So what this means is that there's a general kind of what this means is that when one looks at the general poor state of the autistic population's well-being, it indicates that the usual autism approaches are ineffective. But as I pointed out in my recent article in the Lancet Child and Adolescent Health, like prematurely ratifying demand avoidance PDA as a profile of autism risks denying suitable support strategies to many autistic people, often autistic people in crisis, from receiving suitable support strategies. So the kind of rational demand avoidance PDA binary is likely to promulgate the view that some autistics should not receive suitable approaches focusing on their autonomy and arousal levels, such as like low arousal based approach. So yeah, it's not particularly helpful in my view having this RDA PDA binary. When you look at kind of why does this rational demand avoidance / PDA binary exist, the explanation appears to be from circularity in how PDA profile is being operated and the kind of risk of bias present. So if one looks at the circularity present within the kind of PDA profile autism kind of community and the kind of advocates, one would note that there are vulnerable people present, such as the PDAs themselves and the caregivers. The caregivers has been described as being an at-risk group. There is an inherent assumption within the kind of PDA community that they know what PDA is and other people do not. I've already shown some quotes from them from the PDA community indicating that from the PDA Society. I'll also be showing memes briefly at the end before we get to references on that. But one can view this as being problematic for multiple reasons. So people have noted the risk of bias inherent from prematurely ratifying PDA, and that there's a risk of bias for sourcing participants from places that have a preconceived idea of what PDA is, such as recruiting participants via the PDA Society, for example. There's some other comments I've got, but they'll be in the slides and in the kind of companion notes. So let me quickly conclude. So, yeah, it should be recognised that information from the PDA community is biased and not representative of many PDAs. The rational demand avoidance / PDA binary begs the question: whatever claims originating from the PDA profile ASD advocates is constructed from the bias. Kind of David Milton's and my disagreement with how rational demand is being used in the RDA PDA binary should be acknowledged. And I should point out that I have spoken to Damien Milton about how rational demand has been used, and he's not particularly happy either. So, yeah, there might be a better use of people's time and experience to focus on the shared experience of demand avoidance, as suggested by Jonathan Green in their recent piece, instead of using RDA to as a tool to exclude people. I'm not really expecting the kind of PDA profile ASD advocates to do this. They are instead likely to just adopt alternatives to rational demand avoidance, such as like using logical demand avoidance and to maintain their attacks on me and others correctly at PDA. So, yeah, and these attacks actually against me matter because I should be kind of happy and proud that actually it seems that my critique of PDA, or a significant aspect of my critique of PDA, is kind of valid and correct. However, I'm actually kind of wary of the fact that I'm going to receive quite a lot of abuse from some PDA advocates for this talk. So, yeah, like, we're getting towards the end of the kind of video now, so I'm going to say, like, may your similar activities be many and your flow states long, which is kind of the equivalent to kind of live long and prosper. Those are my contact details, so my email address, my kind of Twitter handle, my ResearchGate link, and a link to the YouTube channel, which you should be watching this video on. And these just kind of, I'm going to be showing you kind of slides that I referred to earlier, but I'm not going to linger on them for too long. I'm going to show them for a few seconds each. If you want to pause the video on them, you can do. Um, so, um, yeah, I'm going to be kind of skimming over this before I get into references, which are again would not be lingering on too long on the references because they'll be in the slides which will be available, and you can just find them there. So yeah, I put quite a lot of time into kind of over the last couple of weeks, kind of reflecting on this topic and producing these slides. So I hope that people found this talk kind of helpful and informative. Um, so yeah, there are 6 reference sites, off the top of my head anyway. So yeah, I just hope this has been kind of an authoritative and what I mean by authoritative is a kind of thorough, a comprehensive talk. So yeah, and that's it. I that's it basically. So I'm going to stop